we then have to understand the implications of that. Would it then be okay for people to have children so that they can pass on financial debt they have to their children and wash their hands of the burden that it carries? So The Big Think is a large YouTube channel that puts out thought pieces from different experts or authors or researchers on a variety of topics. They've just done one with Christine Emba about whether it's unethical or not to have children. Let's see what Christine says and whether it makes any sense.
More and more people are wondering whether it's ethical to have children. It's a consideration that seems somewhat new to our time.
So the question of whether it's ethical to have children or not is actually not a new phenomenon. It's been around for thousands of years, and actually in certain parts of the world or at certain times it was actually quite a significant question that people contended with. Now, there are too many groups or individuals in history that have tackled this question for me to go over now, but if you want to follow along with the history of this question about the individuals and groups who have raised it, then you can follow my playlist on the history of antinatalism. I've linked it in the description, and let's see what else Christine has to say.
But in our current social climate, and our physical climate too, which does feel like it's deteriorating, there's a sense of fatalism, a fear that bringing someone new into the world might be a bad thing. I don't actually feel that this is the case. When it comes to climate change in particular, I don't know that we're making the world better by having less of a stake in it. So what are the risks of not having enough children? They're kind of the straightforward economic ones. Children end up being the caretakers of the adults that came before them. If you want someone to pay into Social Security, say, so that you can retire when you're older, there does have to be someone existing to do that. A child who is born after you. You're seeing the effects of this in countries like Japan and South Korea, where birth rates have fallen dramatically and now the elderly outnumber the young. It's not a pretty scene. But I also don't necessarily think that we can or should have children just to be insured of our Social Security payments, or under the assumption that they will be forced to take care of us while they're old.
The first thing I want to note on here is this idea that people who haven't reproduced have less of a stake in the future, which may be the case in some instances, but it also won't be in other instances. Whether or not we have a stake in the future or whether we're more concerned with what happens in the future can be tied to whether someone has a child or not, but actually that's not the only factor that determines whether someone is concerned about the future. There are many people who don't have children who influence the future and care what happens, and there are many people who do have children who don't really care that much about the future, or at least they say they do, but in their actions they actually clearly don't. It can also be the case that someone who has children does care about the future a lot, but it's not primarily because they have children. In fact, if we thought about all the people who have significant influence about how our future goes, and then we shave off the people that actually don't care how they use that influence, the people we're left with are people who care about the state of our future and have the ability to influence our future. These would be people like billionaires, politicians, people like this. It would actually be really strange for us to hear that all of these people only care about the future because they have children. In fact, in some cultures, and I've spoken about this in my video on whether Gandhi was an antinatalist, not having children is actually seen as more of a way of being committed to the future because you have more time, money, and energy to put into making sure the future goes well. The second thing I wanted to note on, and you do have to give credit to Christine, as she doesn't fall into the trap of viewing children as simply a means to our ends of fixing our own problems. She does say that that's probably not a wise reason to have children, but many people actually do put this forward as a reason, so I very quickly want to address it. If this is the standard by which we're going to say it's okay to have children, we then have to understand the implications of that. Would it then be okay for people to have children so that they can pass on financial debt they have to their children and wash their hands of the burden that it carries? That seems like it would be pretty unethical, but that is actually what we're doing when we create children to solve the problems that we face today in terms of elderly care or paying taxes or any such issue we face in society. That's something that people who want to set this standard need to think about.
Often when people ask, should I have children in the face of climate change or a bad presidency, they're not really asking about children so much as whether there is hope for the future, whether they should be completely fatalistic about the climate or politics or gun violence in schools, whether in fact the human condition is in an inexorable decline. But the thing is, life actually is getting better, and it has gotten better. Before 1800, the average lifespan was around 30 years. Now it's above 70. In our current moment, the voices of people who hadn't been heard in the past are now being heard. change is happening rapidly. Technological advances that we actually can't even think of have the power to shape our future.
So Christine makes a point here about how the material conditions that we find ourselves in the world are actually getting better. Now, there's no need for antinatalists to disagree with this. You can recognize that the conditions that we find ourselves in are generally getting better over time, although that isn't the case for everyone, let alone even non-human animals, that the conditions are getting much worse for. But you can recognize that the conditions that humans generally find themselves in are getting better over time, but also recognize that it's still unethical to create someone. Of course, it's good that material conditions are getting better. One, for people who already exist, but also for the people who will come into existence regardless of our actions. That's a good thing. If someone is going to have to live a life, then it's better that they live in more improved material conditions than the people in the past. But the fact that material conditions are improving is not a reason to create someone. It's just a better circumstance for someone to exist in. The reason it isn't a reason to create someone is because someone only needs improved material conditions to exist in if they've been created. Once we create someone, they then need medicine, food, shelter, love and affection, all these things. This is not something needed by a non-existent person, and so when we're thinking about creating someone and bringing them into the world, the fact that they could enjoy a nice retirement, say, is not a reason to create them. It's just a nice thing to have if they are here.
The Marxist thinker Frederick Jameson is credited with saying, "It's easier to believe in the end of the world than the end of capitalism." And I think there's something similar at play in our conception of the future. It's very easy to imagine how things can go wrong. It's harder for us to imagine how things might go right.
So Christine makes a valid point here, and that's that some people, and that may include a lot of antinatalists, are going to be overly eager to side with the predictions for the future that show it going negatively, rather than those that show the future going better. And that's a bias that we can hold our hands up to and try to correct for in the future. But the thing is that even if we have that bias, that still doesn't defeat the case of antinatalism. Because, like I said before, there is no reason to bring that person into existence. If you create someone and those bad futures do materialize, then you've done something awful. But if you don't create someone and the futures did go well then there's no harm done. You never created anyone, and so they don't exist to be deprived of those good futures. Those futures that have gone better are only good for people who do exist or are going to exist regardless of our actions, because those individuals are actually going to need those improved conditions to live a better life. But someone you don't create doesn't have a life to need to live better. And given the vast uncertainty of how the future is going to go, particularly now with climate change, AI, geopolitics, war, all these things, it's extremely irresponsible to gamble with someone else's life by creating them. Of course, we can all gamble with our own lives and our own time and our own money, but to do that on behalf of someone else with such a grave consequence, that's massively irresponsible.
It is certainly easy to feel that the climate is falling apart, that our political situation is bad or stagnant, maybe even getting worse. But this is also a failure of our own imagination, political and otherwise. It is in fact possible that change can happen, that our children won't live in the present that we live in. And that actually might be a reason for hope. The philosopher Hannah Arendt uses the term natality to describe the possibility inherent in the prospect of birth. There's the potential for change. There is a potential for the world to be better than it is in our time. A new person, a new thing, threatens to upend the current order of things and perhaps even improve it. Having a child can in some sense be a statement of faith and also a mode of change in the future.
So those are the ends of Christine's thoughts. I just wanted to round off by saying that I don't think this sort of general optimistic buzz about change and hope for the future is a good and concrete enough reason to put someone at extraordinary risk of suffering. Yes, of course, creating a new person can change the course of how things go and may even contribute to making the world a better place. But the first thing to say is this is no guarantee. And the second thing to say is, why do we have the right to use someone in that way? By creating them, we will be imposing guaranteed harms on them and the risk of extraordinary suffering. Would we impose the equivalent things on an existing person just because doing so may have some positive impact in how society goes in the future? This seems like a completely unreasonable level of confidence to have in our own understanding of the world and in our own actions that significantly impact identifiable individuals. Anyway, let me know what you thought of what Christine said at the Big Think. Let me know what you thought of my thoughts, and I will see you in the next one.